In the vast silent expanse of the New Mexico desert, history is measured in layers of dust and stone. It is a landscape of profound emptiness, a place where the sky is so large it can hold any secret. In the summer of 1947, just 2 years after the world was violently redefined by the atomic bomb in this very desert, the sky above New Mexico would deliver a secret so powerful, so paradigm-shifting, that its shockwaves are still felt today. This is not just the story of a strange object falling from the sky. This is the story of the moment our world changed, and the story of the extraordinary efforts taken to convince us it never happened. This is the entire history of the Roswell Incident. The story begins, as many strange tales do, with a violent thunderstorm. On a turbulent night in early July, something tore through the storm-wracked sky and crashed into the desolate ranchlands outside the small town of Roswell. The next morning, a local rancher discovered a debris field unlike anything he had ever seen, littered with strange, weightless metals and materials marked with unearthly symbols. The initial response from the local military was swift and stunning. The Roswell Army Airfield, home to the world's only atomic bomb squadron, issued a press release that electrified the globe. They announced they had recovered a flying disc. For a brief, shining moment, humanity was confronted with a reality it had only ever imagined in fiction. But then, just as quickly as it began, the story was killed. Less than 24 hours later, the military held a second press conference. A high-ranking general held up the flimsy remains of a common weather balloon and told the world's media to stand down. They had made a mistake. There was nothing to see here. The story of the flying disc was officially retracted, dismissed as a simple error made by overzealous personnel. The world, for the most part, accepted the explanation and moved on. But the truth, like the strange debris scattered across the desert, refused to be buried so easily. For the next 75 years, the Roswell incident would fester beneath the surface of official history. It became a story whispered by the men who were there, a story of intimidation and sworn secrecy, of a second crash site with not just debris but bodies. It evolved into a sprawling mystery pursued by a dedicated handful of civilian researchers who refused to let the story die. Their investigation would uncover a labyrinth of conflicting official reports, bombshell deathbed confessions from military officers, and chilling accounts from civilian witnesses who saw things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In this documentary, we will trace every step of that investigation. We will go back to the beginning, to the crash, the debris, and the military's baffling reversal. We will uncover the decades of silence and the systematic cover-up that followed. We will meet the key witnesses, examine the evidence, and dissect the official explanations. From weather balloons to top-secret spy projects to crash test dummies, we will separate the credible from the contrived and expose the hoaxes designed to muddy the waters. This is the definitive story of the crash, the cover-up, and the relentless, decades-long search for what really happened in the desert that summer, and what it means for all of us if the official story is not the true one. The story of Roswell begins not with a spaceship, but with the weather. The night of July 2, 1947 was not a quiet one in central New Mexico. A colossal thunderstorm, described by locals as almost biblical in its fury, raged across the plains. Lightning didn't just strike, it tore the sky apart, and thunder echoed like artillery fire across the empty basins. In the post-war quiet of America, this was a familiar and terrestrial violence. But on this particular night, something else was moving through the storm. Several witnesses, scattered miles apart, later reported seeing a strange object in the sky. It was not an aeroplane. It moved with an eerie silence, described as a luminous, circular craft that seemed to be struggling against the storm's fury. Then, a brilliant flash of light, brighter than the lightning around it, was followed by a sound that was not thunder. It was a concussive, explosive boom that suggested a catastrophic failure. Something had fallen. To understand the significance of this event, one must first understand the place where it happened. Roswell, New Mexico, in 1947, was a town defined by one thing: the Roswell Army Airfield. This was not just another military installation. It was the headquarters of the 509th Bombardment Group, the most elite and technologically advanced military unit on the face of the earth. These were the men who had dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just 2 years earlier. They were the sole custodians of the world's nuclear arsenal, entrusted with the most powerful and secretive weapons known to mankind. The base was a fortress of Cold War security, home to the best pilots, the best intelligence officers, and the most advanced radar technology of the era. The idea that the personnel at this specific base could mistake a common weather balloon for anything else was, and remains, profoundly unlikely. The sky above them was the most heavily monitored airspace on the planet, and it was into this charged and watchful environment that something unknown, something otherworldly, came crashing down to Earth. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a rain-soaked desert and a secret that would soon be unearthed. The morning after the storm, on July 3rd, a ranch foreman named William Mac Brazel saddled his horse and rode out to check on his sheep. His ranch was a vast and isolated property, about 75 miles northwest of Roswell. As he rode across the pasture, he began to notice something strange. The ground was littered with debris. This was not the scattered trash of a campsite or the familiar wreckage of a conventional aircraft. The debris field was enormous, stretching for 3/4 of a mile long and several hundred feet wide. It was as if something had disintegrated in the air above, scattering its remains over a huge area. Mac Brazel, a man of the land, knew what a weather balloon looked like. This was something else entirely. He dismounted and began to examine the material. There were countless pieces of a thin, foil-like substance similar to aluminum foil but impossibly strong. He would later describe how he could crumple it into a ball, and when he opened his hand, the material would instantly flatten itself out, leaving not a single crease. Scattered among the foil were small structural beams, or I-beams, made of a material so lightweight it was like balsa wood, yet they could not be bent, dented, or burned. Most peculiar of all, some of these I-beams were covered in strange markings. They were described as small, intricate symbols in a violet or purplish-pink hue, arranged in columns. They resembled no alphabet he had ever seen, closer to what one might call hieroglyphics. There were also pieces of a black, brittle, plastic-like material that resisted all attempts to break it, and fine, thread-like filaments that were incredibly strong. Brazel, a practical and sober man, was completely baffled. He gathered up a box full of the strange wreckage and showed it to his family. After hearing talk in town about flying saucers, he decided this was something the authorities needed to see. July 6th, he drove into Roswell and walked into the office of Sheriff George Wilcox, carrying a box of material that would soon become the most famous and controversial physical evidence in modern history. Sheriff George Wilcox was a small-town lawman, but he knew immediately that the contents of Mac Brazel's box were far beyond his jurisdiction. He picked up the phone and made a call to the one place in town equipped to handle a matter of national security, the Roswell Army Airfield. The call was routed to the office of the base intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel. Major Marcel was the perfect man for the job. He was a seasoned intelligence officer, a veteran of the Pacific Theater in the Second World War, who had been personally decorated for his service. His role at Roswell was to investigate plane crashes and other security incidents. More importantly, as the chief intelligence officer for the 509th Bombardment Group, he was cleared for the highest levels of secrecy. He was trusted, capable, and not prone to fantasy. After hearing the sheriff's report, Marcel drove into town to see the material for himself. What he saw in Brazel's box intrigued him instantly. It matched nothing in his extensive experience with aircraft wreckage, foreign or domestic. He immediately reported back to the base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, who ordered Marcel to take a counterintelligence agent and accompany Brazel back to the ranch to conduct a full investigation of the site. The following day, Marcel and the agent arrived at the sprawling, empty ranchland. The sight that greeted them was staggering. The debris field was immense, far larger than Brazel had described. For Marcel, this was the moment that changed everything. He and his colleague spent the rest of the day walking the field, gathering samples of the bizarre material. The strange, foil-like substance was everywhere. It was feather-light but could not be torn or dented, even with a sledgehammer. It would unfold itself without a single crease. The small, lightweight I-beams with the strange pinkish-purple symbols were also present in large quantities. Marcel, a pilot and crash investigator, was certain of one thing. This was not a weather balloon, and it was not a missile or any known aircraft. The sheer volume of the material and its unearthly properties had a profound effect on him. Convinced he was holding pieces of something truly historic, Marcel made a decision that would become a cornerstone of the Roswell legend. On his way back to the base, he stopped at his home. It was late, but he woke up his wife and his 11-year-old son, Jesse Jr., and spread the debris out on the kitchen floor. He wanted his family to see a piece of history. Years later, Jesse Marcel Jr. would vividly recall that night. He remembered handling the strange weightless foil and seeing the I-beams with symbols that looked like no language on Earth. His father, the decorated intelligence officer, looked at his family and told them he believed what they were looking at was not made by human hands. It was the beginning of a personal conviction that Major Marcel would carry, in secret, for over 30 years. After leaving his home, he drove the collected material to the base, absolutely certain that he was delivering physical proof of a crashed flying saucer into the hands of the United States military. He believed the world was about to change forever. On his return to the Roswell Army Airfield, Major Marcel presented the debris to Colonel Blanchard. The base commander examined the strange materials and listened to his intelligence officer's assessment. The evidence was so compelling, so obviously not from a conventional source, that Colonel Blanchard made a decisive and historic command. He ordered the base's public information officer to issue a press release. On the afternoon of July 8, 1947, a statement was sent out over the wire services that sent an immediate shockwave across the planet. It read, in part, "The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc." The story was an absolute sensation. It was front-page news from New York to London. The Roswell Daily Record ran a banner headline, "RAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region." For a few hours it seemed the most profound question in human history had been answered. The military itself, the very institution of credibility and power, was confirming that we were not alone. The explosion of media attention, however, triggered an immediate and powerful reaction from higher up the chain of command. When the news reached Brigadier General Roger Ramey, the head of the 8th Air Force at his headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas, he took control of the situation. He immediately called Colonel Blanchard and ordered him to silence his personnel and to fly the recovered debris to Fort Worth for inspection without delay. Major Marcel was ordered to personally transport the material. He loaded the boxes of strange, unearthly debris onto a B-29 bomber and flew directly to Fort Worth. But when he landed and was escorted into General Ramey's office, something was wrong. According to Marcel's later testimony, the real debris he had brought from the crash site was whisked away by other officers. A short time later, he was brought into a map room where different material was laid out on the floor. It was the wreckage of a common weather balloon, with its flimsy foil and wooden sticks. General Ramey told the press, who had gathered in a frenzy, that the whole thing had been a mistake. He explained that his men at Roswell had simply misidentified a standard weather tracking device. Major Marcel was then ordered to pose for photographs with the fake wreckage. The pictures that were sent around the world show a decorated intelligence officer looking visibly uncomfortable and defeated, holding up pieces of a tattered balloon. He was forced to be the face of the retraction, a key player in the debunking of his own historic discovery. The official story was born. The military had corrected its error. The flying disc was just a weather balloon. The story died almost as quickly as it had appeared. The press and the public accepted the explanation. But for the men who were there, for Major Jesse Marcel and the others who had seen the real debris, the story was not over. The cover-up had just begun. The weather balloon story was a clean and simple explanation, designed to kill public interest instantly. But to make a story like that stick, the military couldn't just manage the press, it had to manage the people. The cover-up began not in the halls of power in Washington, but in the quiet, dusty corners of New Mexico, with the very man who started it all. Mac Brazel, the Raja who had discovered the field of strange debris, became the first and most important target. After he reported his find to the sheriff, he was not simply interviewed, he was taken into military custody. For nearly a week, he was held at the Roswell Army Airfield guest house, effectively disappearing from public view. During this time, he was subjected to intense interrogation by military intelligence and counterintelligence officers. They wanted to know every single detail of what he saw, who he told, and what he thought it was. His family had no idea where he was. He was a man held incommunicado on a top-secret military base. When Mac Brazel finally re-emerged, he was a changed man. Escorted by military personnel, he gave a new interview to the Roswell Daily Record, the same paper that had just run the flying saucer headline. This time, his story was completely different. He sounded rehearsed and uncomfortable. He now claimed he had made a mistake. He said he knew what weather balloons looked like and he and his son had found them before. He downplayed the significance of the debris, saying he had only gone to the sheriff because he'd heard the flying saucer rumors and thought he might be able to make some money. He was suddenly just a simple rancher who had gotten carried away. After giving this revised story, he rarely spoke of the incident again for the rest of his life. Those who knew him said the military had scared him into silence. His own son, Bill Brazel Jr., would later state that his father was sorry he ever said anything about it, and that he had been forced to take an oath of secrecy. He said his father described the military's intimidation, telling him that if he ever spoke about the real debris again, he would not be a dead man, but he would find himself in a world of trouble. The silencing extended beyond just Mac Brazel. At the KGFL radio station in Roswell, the station manager, Walt Whitmore Sr., had recorded an interview with Brazel before the military took him. In this initial interview, Brazel told the true story of the strange unearthly materials. Before Whitmore could air the tape, he received a phone call. It was not from the local base. The call, according to his son, came directly from Washington, D.C., from the Federal Communications Commission. He was told in no uncertain terms that if he broadcast that interview, his station's license would be revoked within 24 hours. The tape was never aired. The message was clear. This was not a local matter. This was an issue of the highest national security, and the federal government itself was now involved in enforcing the silence. While the public was being fed the weather balloon story, a secret military operation was unfolding in the background. The real debris, the material Major Marcel had collected and flown to Fort Worth, was not studied there. It was merely a brief stop on a much longer, much more secret journey. According to later testimony from multiple sources, including Colonel Thomas Dubose, General Ramey's chief of staff, the debris was immediately repackaged and loaded onto other aircraft. The material shown to the press in Ramey's office was a prop, a decoy. The real prize was already on its way to its final destination, Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. In 1947, Wright Field, which would later become Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, was the nerve center of American military technology. It was home to the Air Materiel Command, the division responsible for analyzing captured enemy technology and reverse engineering it for American use. If the United States recovered a new piece of Soviet hardware or a German secret weapon, it went to Wright Field. It was the most logical and most secure place to send the pieces of a crashed unknown object. Multiple flights were dispatched. Some carried the debris from the Brazel Ranch. But according to a growing body of witness testimony that would only emerge decades later, at least one of these flights carried a far more shocking cargo. The story of a second crash site began to circulate among the military personnel involved. This second site was not a wide, scattered debris field. It was the location of the main body of the craft itself, which had crashed more violently into the desert plains. And it was here, according to these suppressed accounts, that the military recovered not just wreckage, but the craft's crew. The accounts described small, non-human bodies. They were said to be frail, with large heads, large dark eyes and small slender torsos. These bodies, along with the main wreckage, were allegedly crated up under the highest security and also flown directly to Wright Field, where the military had the facilities to conduct autopsies in complete secrecy. This information was considered the most sensitive secret of all. The men involved in the retrieval and transport of this cargo were sworn to absolute silence. their oaths reinforced by direct threats to their careers and their lives. One of the pilots of the B-29 planes that flew out of Roswell, Lieutenant Robert Shirkey, later confirmed he was ordered to fly a crated cargo to Fort Worth, and that the crate was so secret he was not allowed to know what was in it. For 30 years, the story of the bodies and the secret flights to Wright Field remained buried, a piece of forbidden knowledge known only to a handful of men. It was the core of the Roswell secret, the real reason for the aggressive cover-up and the decades of official denial that were to follow. The weather balloon story worked with stunning efficiency. In the summer of 1947, the world was turbulent, exhausted by war and anxious about the new atomic age. A simple, mundane explanation for a strange event was not just accepted, it was welcomed. The public, guided by the press, collectively shrugged and turned its attention to more terrestrial concerns. The Roswell Incident, the brief, blazing story of a captured flying disc, was extinguished. It did not become a lingering mystery or a famous case. It was filed away as a solved misunderstanding, a minor embarrassment for an overeager military base. It became a non-event, a historical footnote so insignificant that it was almost immediately forgotten by everyone except the handful of people who knew it was a lie. For the next 3 decades, an impenetrable wall of silence surrounded the events of July 1947. The Cold War began in earnest, and the skies that were once watched for flying saucers were now scanned for Soviet bombers. National security became the ultimate justification for secrecy, and the government's ability to keep secrets became an art form. Major Jesse Marcel, the man who had held alien technology in his hands, continued his career in the Air Force. He was a man living with a profound and explosive secret, yet he kept his oath. He never spoke of what he truly saw at the debris field. He was transferred from Roswell and moved from base to base, quietly serving his country, all the while knowing that the single most important discovery in human history had been covered up, and that he had been forced to be the public face of that lie. In Roswell itself, life went on. The town remained a quiet military community in the New Mexico desert. The witnesses, like Mac Brazel and the radio station manager Walt Whitmore Sr., kept their silence, intimidated into compliance. Their children heard whispers, fragments of a story they were told never to repeat. The memory of the crash didn't die, but it went deep underground, becoming a piece of forbidden local folklore. Meanwhile, behind the curtain of national security, the secret was very much alive. The debris and the alleged bodies recovered from the desert were now the property of the military's top scientific and intelligence minds at Wright Field. The event became what is known as a black program, an operation so highly classified that its very existence is denied. The creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in September of 1947, just 2 months after the crash, established a new, powerful apparatus for managing such secrets. The Roswell material and the knowledge gained from it was now locked away in the deepest vaults of the American intelligence community. For 30 years, the official story held firm. The phenomenon of unidentified flying objects continued, with famous sightings and official investigations like Project Blue Book capturing public attention throughout the 1950s and 60s. But Roswell was never mentioned. It was a ghost, an incident that, according to the official record, had never truly happened. The silence was absolute. The witnesses began to age, memories began to fade. The secret seemed secure, buried forever under the weight of time and the authority of the United States government. It appeared as though the truth of what fell in the desert that summer would be taken to the graves of the men who were there. But secrets, especially secrets this large, have a half-life. They decay over time, and the pressure to tell the truth can build to an unbearable level in a person's soul. As the 1970s drew to a close, one of the central figures in the cover-up was about to reach his breaking point. The 30 years of silence were about to end, not with a government press release, but with the quiet confession of one old soldier to one persistent researcher. The wall of silence was not breached by a government leak or a declassified document. It was broken by the patient, relentless work of one man, Stanton Friedman. Friedman was not a sensationalist or a treasure hunter. He was a nuclear physicist who had worked on highly classified research and development projects for major corporations. He was a scientist, trained to follow evidence, and he had developed a serious academic interest in the topic of unidentified flying objects. In the mid-1970s, while researching the UFO phenomenon, Friedman kept hearing whispers of a long-forgotten story about a crashed saucer in New Mexico. The story was always vague, a piece of old folklore, but one name kept coming up in his interviews with retired military personnel: Jesse Marcel. He was told that if anyone knew the truth about the crash, it was Marcel. Friedman began a years-long search. In 1978, after countless phone calls and dead ends, he finally located a Jesse Marcel living in Homer, Louisiana. He made the call, not knowing if it was the right man or if he would even talk. He asked a simple question: "Were you the intelligence officer at Roswell back in 1947? The man on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke. "Yes, I was," he said. Friedman then asked him about the weather balloon. Jesse Marcel, now a retired lieutenant colonel, began to laugh. "That's not what I saw," he said. The 30-year-old dam of secrecy had finally broken. Over the course of several interviews, Marcel, now in his 70s, unburdened himself of the secret he had carried for 3 decades. He told Friedman everything. He described the call from the sheriff, his trip to the ranch, and the astonishing sight of the debris field. He spoke with the precision of a trained intelligence officer, describing materials that defied all earthly logic. He detailed the foil-like substance that could not be burned, dented, or creased. He described the small, weightless I-beams marked with what he called hieroglyphics, symbols that belonged to no language he had ever seen. He was emphatic, stating on tape it was not anything from this earth. That I'm pretty well convinced of. Marcel recounted the trip back to the base, stopping at his home to show the historic find to his wife and son. He then detailed the flight to Fort Worth, the meeting with General Ramey, and the moment his world was turned upside down. He described how the real debris was taken away and how he was ordered to pose with the wreckage of a common weather balloon for the press. He spoke of the humiliation and the frustration of being forced to participate in the lie. He explained that he was a military officer and he had to follow orders, but that the order was to perpetrate a cover story. His testimony was a bombshell. It was the first time a high-ranking, credible, on-the-record witness had confirmed that the weather balloon story was a deliberate fabrication. Stanton Friedman had found the key and he had just turned it. The investigation was officially reopened. Jesse Marcel's story was explosive, but it was confined to the debris field. He never claimed to have seen the craft's occupants. But once his testimony became public, it created a permission structure for others to come forward. It was as if the fear that had held so many in silence for so long had finally begun to dissolve. The story that emerged was far more complex and disturbing than just a field of strange metal. Researchers now had a new timeline and a new set of questions. They began to uncover evidence of a second location, not the wide debris field that Mac Brazel had found, but a separate impact site where the main body of the craft had come down. As they dug deeper, a new wave of witnesses emerged, many of them former military personnel who were now retired and nearing the end of their lives. And they started talking about bodies. Sergeant Frederick Benthel was stationed at the Roswell base and was part of the team sent out to the crash site. In a later interview, he described seeing a military cordon around a crashed object embedded in the side of a cliff. He claimed he saw medical tents and personnel in biological protection suits. He said he was told by a military policeman that they were recovering bodies, describing them as small with large heads. Frank Kaufman, a civilian who worked for the military at Roswell, also came forward with a detailed account. He claimed to be part of a special team that was taken to the impact site. He described a delta-shaped craft cracked open like an egg. He too claimed to have seen the small non-human occupants of the craft, providing descriptions that were strikingly similar to those given by other independent witnesses. The stories painted a picture of a massive, secret military operation. Witnesses described seeing flatbed trucks moving a large tarp-covered object. They reported a heavy military presence, with armed guards turning away all civilians and even other military personnel who were not directly involved. The entire area was locked down with an efficiency that only the 509th Bombardment Group could muster. These new accounts suggested that the Brazil debris field was just one part of a much larger event. The theory developed that the object had experienced an explosion or failure in mid-air, shedding the lighter debris over Brazil's ranch before the main craft continued on for several more miles and crashed. This explained why the military's primary focus seemed to be on this second, more secret location. It was one thing to recover strange materials. It was another thing entirely to recover the beings who had piloted the craft. The cover-up suddenly made much more sense. A weather balloon could explain away strange metal, but it could never explain away dead aliens. The Roswell story had taken a dark and profound turn. It was no longer just about a crashed disk. It was about the recovery of an extraterrestrial crew. As the accounts of a second crash site and recovered bodies began to surface, researchers started looking for corroboration from a different angle. If non-human bodies were recovered, the military would have needed specialized equipment and expertise to handle them. This line of inquiry led them to a man named Glenn Dennis, who in 1947 was a young mortician working at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. His testimony would become one of the most compelling and controversial pieces of the entire puzzle. In 1989, Dennis came forward with an extraordinary story. He claimed that on the day of the alleged crash he received several unusual phone calls at the funeral home from the mortuary officer at the Roswell Army Airfield. The officer asked a series of strange hypothetical questions. First, he asked Dennis if the funeral home had any small, hermetically sealed caskets available. Dennis replied that they did not, as such items were not standard. The officer then asked about the best way to preserve bodies that had been exposed to the elements for several days. Dennis offered his professional advice, still thinking the questions were odd, but perhaps related to a conventional air crash. The questions, however, grew stranger. The officer called back and asked him how one might handle the dissection of bodies that had been contaminated by a non-terrestrial biological agent. He wanted to know what chemical reactions to expect and what procedures to follow to avoid contaminating the tissues. Dennis was now completely baffled and alarmed. Later that day, according to his account, Dennis was at the Roswell Base Hospital on an unrelated ambulance call. He saw military activity was unusually high. He noticed strange star-shaped wreckage with purple writing on it being loaded out of the back of a military ambulance. It was then that he ran into a young nurse he knew. She seemed distraught and terrified. He arranged to meet her for coffee later at the base officers' club. When they met, she was still shaking. In a state of extreme agitation, she told him she had been in an examination room where doctors were performing a preliminary autopsy on several small, non-human bodies. She described them in detail, mentioning their large heads, large dark eyes, and small, frail frames with 4 thin fingers. The nurse claimed the smell in the room was horrific, and the doctors were struggling to understand the biological structure of the beings. She was deeply traumatized by what she had witnessed. She drew a diagram of the beings on a napkin for Dennis to illustrate what she had seen. She warned him to forget their conversation, telling him, "If you ever say anything about this, they will have you out in the desert." Glenn Dennis claimed that this nurse was transferred to England just a few days later and that all attempts to contact her failed. He believed she had been silenced or simply disappeared by the military. His story, if true, was the first civilian corroboration from inside the military base of the recovery of alien bodies. It provided a chilling, ground-level view of the secret activities at the base hospital and lent significant weight to the claims of the other military witnesses. By the early 1990s, the Roswell story had gained unstoppable momentum. With dozens of witnesses, including high-ranking military officers on the record, the original weather balloon explanation was no longer credible. The sheer volume of testimony, combined with pressure from the public and even from members of Congress, forced the United States Air Force to officially reopen its own investigation. The Air Force could no longer ignore the case. In 1994, it published its first official report attempting to explain the Roswell Incident. The report acknowledged that the weather balloon story from 1947 was not the full truth. It admitted that something more significant had been recovered. The new explanation was that the debris was not a standard weather balloon, but rather a balloon train from a top-secret program called Project Mogul. This was a highly classified Cold War project designed to use high-altitude balloons equipped with sensitive microphones to listen for the sound waves of Soviet atomic bomb tests. The Air Force argued that the materials used in these Mogul balloons, reflective foil, reinforced tape, and balsa wood beams, could have been mistaken for something exotic by people unfamiliar with the top-secret project. They claimed the so-called hieroglyphics seen by Jesse Marcel were simply decorative symbols on the reinforced tape used by a toy company that supplied some of the materials. This new explanation accounted for the debris, but it did nothing to address the growing number of witnesses who claimed to have seen bodies. The pressure continued to build, and the Air Force was forced to release a second, much larger report in 1997. On the 50th anniversary of the event. This second report, titled The Roswell Report Case Closed, was an attempt to finally put the matter to rest. To explain the accounts of recovered alien bodies, the Air Force introduced a new and startling theory. It claimed that the witnesses who saw bodies were not lying, but were simply confusing their memories. The report stated that the military had been conducting high-altitude parachute drop experiments in the New Mexico desert in the 1950s, several years after the Roswell crash. These experiments used life-size anthropomorphic dummies, or crash test dummies, to test escape procedures for pilots. These dummies were bald, had a somewhat alien appearance, and would have been seen being recovered by military personnel in remote desert locations. The Air Force's official position was that the witnesses had conflated two separate events in their minds. They had merged the memory of seeing debris from the 1947 Project Mogul balloon with a separate, later memory of seeing crash test dummies being recovered in the 1950s. Over the decades, the Air Force argued, these two distinct memories had blended into one dramatic but false story of a crashed saucer with alien bodies. For believers in the crash, this explanation was seen as absurd and insulting. It dismissed the detailed, specific testimony of dozens of witnesses, including morticians and decorated military officers, as the product of mass confusion. The Air Force had replaced one simple cover story with two complex and, to many, unbelievable ones. The case was officially closed, but for the investigators and the witnesses, the battle for the truth was far from over. Just as the Air Force was attempting to close the book on Roswell with Project Mogul and crash test dummies, the story was about to be hijacked by one of the most sensational and damaging hoaxes in modern history. In 1995, a grainy black-and-white film surfaced that promised to be the one thing every investigator had dreamed of. The Smoking Gun. A British music and video producer named Ray Santilli announced that he had obtained original top-secret military footage from 1947. It was, he claimed, the official film of the autopsy performed on one of the alien bodies recovered from the Roswell crash. He said he acquired it from a retired military cameraman who wanted the truth to come out but wished to remain anonymous. The footage was broadcast on television networks around the world, often as part of major primetime specials. The public was captivated. The film showed two figures dressed in full-body contamination suits, inside a sterile-looking room. On a medical table lay the body of a distinctly non-human being. The creature was small and frail, with a large bulbous head, no discernible hair, and large, dark, almond-shaped eyes. Most notably, it had 6 fingers on its hands and 6 toes on its feet. The film proceeded to show, in graphic detail, the systematic dissection of the creature. The surgeons cut into the torso, removing large, unidentifiable organs and examining the contents of the skull. For millions of people, this was it. This was the proof. The jerky camera movements and degraded film quality gave it an air of authenticity. The Roswell Incident exploded from a niche UFO case into a global phenomenon. For a brief period, the alien autopsy film was the definitive image of the Roswell mystery. Almost immediately, however, serious researchers and experts began to raise red flags. The story had problems. Pathologists who reviewed the footage noted that the autopsy techniques were clumsy and unprofessional. The surgeons held their scalpels like pencils, not like trained medical professionals. The organ removal seemed haphazard and more for show than for genuine scientific examination. Special effects artists also grew suspicious. They pointed out that while the creature looked impressive, its movements and the way its skin reacted to the incisions were consistent with a prosthetic model, not a real biological entity. Furthermore, the detail of 6 fingers directly contradicted the testimony of the primary Roswell witnesses, like Glenn Dennis's nurse, who had consistently described beings with 4 or 5 fingers. The pressure on Ray Santilli mounted for years. His story about the mysterious military cameraman was impossible to verify. Under intense scrutiny from investigators and journalists, his claims began to unravel. Finally, in 2006, the truth came out. Santilli admitted that the film that had shocked the world was not, in fact, original 1947 footage. He confessed that it was a reconstruction. His new story was that he had seen a real film, but it had degraded and become unusable. So he hired a special effects artist, John Humphreys, to create a prosthetic alien body, and hired a team to stage and film a recreation of what he remembered seeing. Most investigators and even former believers in the film now accept it as a complete and total hoax. The reconstruction story is widely seen as a last-ditch effort by Santilli to save face after being exposed. The film was a fiction, a brilliant and lucrative piece of showmanship that played on public fascination with the Roswell story. The legacy of the Santilli film is a complicated one. On one hand, it made Roswell a household name around the globe, but on the other, it did profound damage to the credibility of legitimate research. For skeptics, the autopsy hoax became proof that the entire Roswell story was a product of fantasy and fraud. It allowed them to dismiss the compelling testimony of credible witnesses like Jesse Marcel by lumping them in with a con artist like Ray Santilli. The film stands as a powerful cautionary tale. It shows how easily genuine mystery can be tainted by manufactured hysteria, and how the search for truth can be derailed by a single sensational lie. It muddied the waters of the Roswell case in a way that researchers are still dealing with to this day. For 30 years after the crash, Roswell was a town with a buried secret. But once Stanton Friedman and Jesse Marcel broke the silence, the town's identity began a slow, strange, and remarkable transformation. It evolved from a quiet agricultural and military community into the undisputed global capital of all things extraterrestrial. The initial change was driven by researchers and authors who flocked to the town, but the real shift began in the early 1990s. 2 of the original researchers, Stanton Friedman and Don Schmidt, along with local witness Glenn Dennis, founded the International UFO Museum and Research Center. Housed in a former movie theater in downtown Roswell, it became a central repository for the witness testimonies, documents, and history of the case. The museum was a massive success. It gave tourists and believers a physical destination, a place to come and immerse themselves in the story. This success sparked a commercial boom. Local entrepreneurs realized there was a powerful new brand associated with their town. Slowly, at first, and then all at once, Roswell leaned into its new identity. Today, the influence of the 1947 incident is inescapable. The streetlights in the city center are adorned with alien-like eyes. Murals depicting flying saucers and green men cover the sides of buildings. Businesses adopted the theme with gusto, from the Alien Zone gift shop to the Stella coffee shop. You can find alien-themed everything, from hot sauce to novelty driver's licenses. The centerpiece of this new identity is the annual Roswell UFO Festival. Every July, thousands of people from all over the world descend on the town to commemorate the anniversary of the crash. The festival is a surreal mix of serious academic inquiry and carnival-like fun. Researchers give lectures at the museum while enthusiasts in full alien costume parade down Main Street. For the city of Roswell, the incident has become its primary economic engine. What was once a source of fear and official intimidation is now the town's lifeblood, generating millions of dollars in tourism revenue each year. It has given Roswell a unique and permanent place on the world map. The town's relationship with its legacy is complex. Some older residents remember the time before the UFO craze and view it with a degree of bemusement. But most have embraced it, recognizing that the strange events of 1947 saved their town from the economic decline that has affected many other small American communities. Roswell is no longer just a place, it is an idea, a destination for pilgrims, a ground zero for the belief that we are not alone in the universe. So after more than 75 years of testimony, denial, research, and ridicule, what is the truth? What really happened in the New Mexico desert in July of 1947? The answer remains fiercely debated, locked in a struggle between two fundamentally irreconcilable narratives. On one side stands the official explanation from the United States Air Force. This story posits that the debris came from a top-secret Project Mogul balloon, and that all the accounts of alien bodies are the result of witnesses confusing this event with later memories of seeing crash test dummies. It is a narrative of mundane terrestrial secrets and the fallibility of human memory. On the other side stands the extraordinary claim, built on a foundation of dozens of first-hand and second-hand witness accounts. This story tells of a crashed extraterrestrial vehicle, of strange unearthly materials, and of the recovery of its non-human crew. It is a narrative of a world-changing event followed by an immediate and absolute government cover-up. The evidence for the extraterrestrial crash is compelling but problematic. It rests almost entirely on human testimony. We have the word of decorated officers like Jesse Marcel, professionals like the Mortician Glenn Dennis, and dozens of other military and civilian witnesses. Their accounts, taken together, paint a consistent and powerful picture. The central question they raise is simple. Why would so many credible people with nothing to gain lie about something so profound? Yet there is no smoking gun. After decades of searching, no one has ever produced a single verifiable piece of the craft. There are no authenticated photos of the bodies, no government documents that have leaked confirming the story. All we have are the memories of people, many of whom are now gone. The official explanation, while less spectacular, also has significant problems. The Project Mogul theory may account for some of the debris, but it fails to explain the more extreme properties described by witnesses. More importantly, the confused memories and crash test dummy theory strikes many as contrived and insulting, a convenient way to dismiss the testimony of decorated veterans and respected citizens. It seems to ask a bigger question. Would the United States military truly orchestrate such an aggressive, multi-decade cover-up, complete with threats against its own personnel, just to hide a balloon? This is the enduring heart of the Roswell mystery. The scale of the cover-up seems wildly disproportionate to the official cause. The actions taken in 1947 were not those of a military unit explaining a simple mistake. They were the actions of an organization desperately trying to contain a secret of the highest possible magnitude. In the end, Roswell has become more than just a historical event. It is a modern myth that reflects our deepest questions about the universe and our deepest suspicions about the secrecy of government. Whether it was a balloon, a secret experiment, or a ship from another world, the incident in the desert has left a permanent mark on our culture. The truth remains out there, buried under layers of time, secrecy, and speculation. Was it a case of mistaken identity blown out of proportion? Or was it the day the world changed forever, a truth so staggering that it had to be hidden away, leaving us with only the echoes of what happened, and the question that will not die: what really fell at Roswell?